So, traditional Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well as many times.
Preston.
Hey, Katie.
Things are getting spookier.
Right? We're getting closer to Spooktober.
Yes.
Have you not heard people call it that?
I feel like that's really stretching for a cute name for October.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Oh, okay. What are we talking about today on
The Holy Watermelon Podcast? We're talking about voodoo.
Spooky.
Right? Well,
No, it's not really.
the way it's depicted in pretty much all of popular media, absolutely, it's meant to be a little bit spooky.
But like most religions, it's just misunderstood.
Yeah.
Oh.
More than most.
Yes. There are some perhaps macabre parts to voodoo, but we'll talk about that.
But there's some dark and shady and seldom visited corners of most religious
That's
traditions. True. So I don't think this is really that much different.
All right. Well, let's talk about it.
There's actually kind of a lot of variety within what we like to call voodoo. And I mean, it's not even all voodoo. There's so many different ways to pronounce this one word based on different cultures.
Well, and I'll just interject and say originally we wanted this episode to be on both voodoo and hoodoo. And then I realized how big voodoo was and I cut the hoodoo because I was like, there's no way we can cover both properly in about an hour. So
yeah, I think that was the right choice.
Thank you.
But the Vodun tradition comes from West Africa. If you want to imagine Africa, for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with geography, that little, the armpit, I guess, and that's not the best way to describe it to keep friends with people who are from there, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the countries that are there, that's
a little indent.
A helpful description. Yeah. The countries that are along the Gulf of Guinea is where the Vodun tradition primarily is born, with the Aja people.
Mm-hmm. And then Vodun made its way to the Americas through really shady means.
Shady? Yeah. I mean, perfectly legal slavery.
Yes. Yeah. So the spirit-based tradition that is Vodun moved on over to 4 countries predominantly, Haiti, Cuba, Dominican Republic. Dominica and Dominican Republic are 2 different countries.
They are.
And then you get the migration of people from those countries to America, where Louisiana voodoo is kind of its own entity. So we'll talk about all of those today.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting the way that the Vodun tradition has evolved over the years. Like Shintoism, an awful lot of people found it difficult to classify it as a religion unto itself. When we talked about Shinto, even though everybody in Japan was Shinto, basically, they didn't see it as a religion. They thought it was easy to adopt another national religion.
It becomes so integrated.
It's just part of the culture.
It's
it's
like
part
language.
of the identity.
Yeah, you don't even think about.
Yeah. And so the way that the Vodun tradition and respect for spirits and everything that is attached to it carried along with the people who were displaced by slave traders, they adapted their religion, primarily including a lot of principles from Catholicism. And so there's a lot of syncretic elements taken from Catholicism and transposed onto the Vodun tradition in really interesting ways.
Yeah, let's expand on the term syncretic, because this is the first time I have really heard about it and dug deep into it. So for our listeners, let's define syncretic religions a little bit.
Syncretism is the practice of taking features from one tradition and incorporating them into your own. That's the short of it. And there, you can see it in a lot of different ways. The Roman Catholic tradition is also originally very syncretic, adopting a lot of features from Greek and Roman culture and why it's so very different from Judaism, from which it initially was born. And there's a couple other little similarities I thought were nifty comparing it to Shinto. Remember we talked how Shinto has a different name for the religion among the people who practice it. Often you'll hear it called Kami no Michi, which means the way of the spirits. Vodun literally means spirit. So I thought that was really nifty, a nice little parallel. And so they believe spirits are in everything, but there's one main creator, pretty similar to a lot of the religions that we've talked about, especially tightly similar to Shintoism.
There, obviously, like any religion, there's varying degrees, but one thing I read about the main creator is that it's a very hands-off creator, where they built the world and said bye and left it to the spirits.
Yeah, there's not a lot of religions look at their theology that way. Some of the founding fathers of the United States were deists that had adopted that particular idea, though.
Where there was an initial mover and then he said, bye, I got other things to do. Have fun.
Yeah, exactly. And so instead of interacting with this great creator who is now unreachable, you deal with a lot of intermediaries and call upon them to do some pretty cool things.
Which sounds a lot like Catholic saints,
right?
Which is where they get this really interesting mix.
Yeah, so when all these people who are displaced by trade, they are told that you can't worship your old way, you have to worship our way. And they're like, well, that's not terribly different, so fine.
Yeah, you sound a lot like this guy I know.
Right?
They must just have the name wrong, silly white folk.
Yeah, that's kind of the deal. And so it was easy enough for them to adapt enough to avoid beatings.
Perfect? That's the wrong word, but okay.
Yeah, that's unfortunately everything that we see in popular voodoo, as far as we see it in the Western Hemisphere, is coming from a place of pain, which is really unfortunate, but there's an awful lot of celebration in it as well.
Yeah, we'll dive more into the perception of voodoo as we go throughout this episode. I just want to mention that's in our notes before we dive into beliefs, that the spirits in voodoo are called lua. Lua is their term for a specific spirit.
We've talked a lot about how a lot of, your mileage may vary with a lot of religions.
Right.
And that's incredibly true with the voodoo traditions. Even when you talk about Louisiana voodoo, there is some variety from one town to the next, from one family to the next. So,
I mean,
like I've always heard it pronounced Loa rather than Lua. That's not to say Lua is wrong. It's just there's a lot of variety, and there's many different spellings because of the way people pronounce it differently.
I mean, just like from Christian church to Christian church, it's going to be a little bit different.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, I did put in my notes that there's actually some interesting, though not entirely valuable for educational depictions of voodoo in popular culture. Some of my favorites are the use of voodoo in American Horror Story, and also in Marvel's Cloak and Dagger was actually kind of cool.
I'm really upset that you didn't add the Princess and the Frog to this list.
I haven't seen the whole movie.
What?
Is the problem.
What?
I'm aware that it is Baron Samedi that's in that movie, right?
I don't know if he's named as Baron Samedi, but there is the dark character as Disney, picks Hades or something and wrecks it. There is a dark. Yeah, there's the bad guy. I don't know if he's called. It's been years since I've seen. I don't know if he's called Baron Samedi, but he's obviously based off of Baron Samedi.
Right.
Which
see, I haven't seen the whole movie.
There is one of the ladies in the movie is the voodoo. She's supposed to be a voodoo priestess.
Sure.
But again, it's been a minute since I've seen it myself, so we're gonna get some angry email being like, "You have it wrong." But maybe
there's reasons I didn't put it on my list.
Oh, okay. But it's such a good movie.
I believe you. I don't remember it because I didn't see all of it.
We'll have to have a movie night.
I guess so.
So what do people who follow voodoo actually believe? Guess what? It's not devil worship.
Yeah, an awful lot of people like to say that voodoo is evil because they deny God and worship Satan. I don't know where people come up with these ideas.
I mean, if it's like one thing, if you, and not that I'm saying this is a good thing, but it's one thing if you think people are evil because they're whatever, not your religion, not Christian, not Jewish, not whatever. But then to like then put on them that they believe in Satan when they don't follow the first group, like only those Abrahamic religions believe in Satan. So if they're not an Abrahamic religion, then don't throw Satan on top of it.
Right.
It's just too much.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a huge problem. People don't like talking to each other, and huge misunderstandings come out of that.
And actually, on that devil worship topic, voodoo, even though it's syncretic with the Catholic Church, does not have a satanic equivalent.
Right.
They do not have any figure that they go, oh yeah, Satan. So even though there are these elements of Christianity in voodoo, they don't have any belief in the devil or this big bad evil thing.
Yeah, the closest they get, let's go back to that issue we have with Hades in the Hercules cartoon,
Yeah.
where Hades is for some reason a bad guy because he's the closest thing we can come up with to a king of the underworld as Satan, who is not the king of the underworld like Hades is. And so Papa Legba or Baron Samedi serve as the keeper of the dead. And so that's why he is occasionally portrayed as a villainous character, which is nonsense.
Well, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but in voodoo, death isn't this negative thing that it is in the Abrahamic religions.
Right.
So ergo, he's even less evil than you might think he is.
Right.
Even though he's just watching the dead, which is a noble job.
Right? Yeah. The way people look at religions is just so weird. And that's why we're here.
Right.
To hopefully fix that.
Okay, I really like the semantics of the creator of the universe.
Right?
Do you want to talk about Mawu? Because I didn't actually find that note. I found it on Bonnie.
Right.
So I want to talk about Bonnie.
Broadly speaking, the West African tradition addresses the great creator goddess as Mawu or Mahu. I find Mahu a little easier to say, but Mawu I think is actually slightly more common pronunciation. And thanks to the French influence on the tradition as it came across the Great Big Lake, or the ocean.
I love this. It makes me so excited.
The creator of the universe has a kind of a cooler name.
But it's fun because it comes full circle. So because of the French influence and colonization and the slave trade, Le Bon Dieu means the good God.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Haitian tradition, it turned into Bonnie or Bonji. But then in the Louisiana tradition, which came after, it turned back into Le Bon Dieu because of the French influence in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. Right?
I guess it'd be the Acadian influence in Louisiana. But I just thought that was pretty cool that it went from Le Bon Dieu to Bondi to Le Bon Dieu again.
Right.
And it all just means the good God.
So Mahu or Bonnie or Bon Dieu is connected to the moon. And there is a male counterpart that is connected to the sun. And his name is Lisa, which I assume for many people listening like me, that sounds an awful lot more like a woman's name.
I have the Simpsons Lisa birthday song in my head now. Lisa, it's your birthday.
But Lisa is, coming from a different culture, not weird to see as a man's name. But Mahu has 7 children that I think are pretty cool, and each of them are a Vodun of a specific element, I guess, of the way that the world is understood. We have Sakpata, the Vodun of the earth, which is kind of cool. It just takes care of the earth. That's almost half of Hades' job, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got Agbe, Vodun of the sea. Jo, Vodun of the air. So Hades, Neptune, and Zeus. I'm totally mixing together things, aren't I? Neptune is Roman.
Yep.
Poseidon.
Poseidon.
Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. I'm ashamed that I mix those things together. See how often I talk about Greek stuff.
I guess I'll have to cover that in the new year.
Right?
Get you back up to speed.
We've got Age, a Vodun of the forest. And also as an extension of that, pretty much anything relating to agriculture. And then we've got Zevioso, Vodun of thunder.
Wingardium Levioso.
Right? That came to my mind too. So in addition to being the Vodun of thunder, he's also responsible for justice. And then we've got Gu, the Vodun of iron and also of war. And then Legba, sometimes called Papa Legba, Vodun of the unpredictable and fate and a variety of things attached to that. He's kind of like the god of, like, not everything else, but kind of that catch-all title of an awful lot of things that aren't part of the other things.
Things that are just too hard to predict.
Right? So it's a kind of a cool set of 7 siblings instead of 3, as are actually really quite common in a lot of other
Totally.
Collections of gods.
Especially as you get into older religions, having things based off of the elements is super common.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so as Preston mentions, the Loa are intermediaries between humans and Mahu or Bandu, and they will help you in exchange for ritual service. And
you all right?
yeah, I just have a stroke. I just don't know how to move into the next line.
Oh, okay.
So deceased voodoo priests and priestesses may become Loa, or you can have talismans or objects that can also become Loa. Surprisingly similar to Shinto, right? Right from the ritual service to who or what can become a spirit. I find it interesting because I don't think they would have had any influence on each other, which is why I find
feel
it
pretty confident that you're right.
right, which is why I find the similarities fascinating. Like, it's one thing to be like, oh, there's similarities in Judaism and Christianity. But these
that's
are,
to be expected.
Right? But there's these are two cultures that, again, I assume have never, or in the time of development, would never have.
Well, one's Atlantic Ocean stuff and one's Pacific Ocean stuff.
Yeah.
And Shintoism, I guess, spread across the Pacific Ocean about the same time that this Vodun tradition spread across the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't really have much time to mix. It's just kind of a cool way to look at and study primal religions, I guess.
Maybe they're the ones who are right.
Maybe.
Because they were both developed in a vacuum and they're the same.
I don't think anything's developed in a vacuum, and they're not the same, but they have similarities.
Fine.
But they're absolutely worth studying in much greater detail than what we're going to offer in this episode. And like you mentioned before, most Loa have been linked to Catholic saints. Papa Legba, in his role of taking care of the keys to the spirit world, is very often connected to St. Peter. I think that's pretty cool, being the dude who holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Take over.
Oh, I was like, do you want me to take over the
grab the next one.
Okay. And then there's Damballa, who is a serpent spirit, and he is linked to St. Patrick, who notoriously chased all the snakes out of Ireland.
What an ironic connection there. That seems a little bit weird
Well,
to me.
I'm sure they would have heard the story of St. Patrick of chasing the snakes out of Ireland. And they're like, oh, okay. He's king of the serpents.
Maybe that's how they swung it. Because when I initially read that, I'm like, but one is
a snake.
One is the serpent Vodun Loa fella, and the other one, like, celebrated for getting the snakes out of Ireland.
Now I need to
or the Druids, however you want to look at it.
It was the Druids. There were never snakes in Ireland.
But he also didn't get rid of the Druids either. He converted many, but Druids
is he
persisted.
a saint that shouldn't be a saint? I'm kidding. He was a pervert. I wish I had looked deeper into Damballa, because maybe he's the king of the serpents and can control them.
Maybe.
And so then, because St. Patrick can control the serpents and send them on their way, they were like, oh, cool. Sweet.
Sure.
I'm just a conjecture at this point.
Vodun theology is best described as monotheistic polylatric,
That's a new one.
right? So we've talked about monotheism, worship of one single God, or, well, not just the worship, but the belief in a
There's
single
only
God.
one God. Yeah.
And then polylatric means that you worship many beings. And so that's basically how we look at the Vodun tradition, that there is one creator God. Of course, he said, peace out. Y'all can deal with the rest of the Vodun and the Loas. And so polylatric is the worship of all of those figures. So there's an awful lot of variety. People will latch onto a specific Vodun or Loa that they find valuable to their worship, much like you see in the Catholic tradition, where people will hang on to a specific saint for most of their interests, I guess, and then occasionally branch out to other saints when necessary for their specific needs relative to that saint. But people have patron saints and favorite saints. Same for the voodoo tradition.
My favorite saint is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux.
The lactation. What a great miracle.
All right.
What's interesting, though, is that the idea of this theological model goes a little bit deeper. Like we've talked about, some traditions, they look one thing, and then you dig a little deeper and it looks a little bit differently. In the Vodun tradition, it's kind of funky that because the creator God is sometimes described as encompassing all things, which would lead us to a panentheistic conclusion, there is a distinct separation between the creature and the unapproachable creator. So it's not true panentheism. It's kind of an interesting and complicated distinction we see here.
Look at you, just splitting hairs.
Right?
Did you know, Preston, that voodoo practitioners prefer priestesses to priests, contrary to most religions?
I had suspected it based on the way it's depicted in some of the more interesting popular media that I've consumed, but I didn't know that before I actually went and dug deep into this.
Yeah. And I guess I've definitely seen them, if you'd asked me prior to research, in equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
But digging deeper, yeah, I saw more on voodoo priestesses and voodoo priests.
Yeah. It's kind of nifty that the idea of a voodoo priestess would have actually been incredibly offensive to a lot of the colonists in the Americas 200
still
years
in
ago.
Catholicism, you can't have a female priest, so
Right? But the idea that you have a powerful black woman up against the power of the white man, that was offensive to an awful lot of people. I mean, it still is, let's be real.
which is why voodoo gets the scary washing that it does.
I think you're right.
It's absolutely rooted in racism. And these priestesses will perform regular family ceremonies like marriages, funerals, and baptisms, just like a non-voodoo priest would.
Right? It's kind of cool. It was weird to me when I first saw that these voodoo priestesses perform baptisms, and then I remembered, oh yeah, even Katie can perform a baptism and have it recognized by the Catholic Church.
Really?
Yeah.
How do I do that?
Well, first you have to profess the faith in Christ and feel the need to perform the baptism, and then you're good to go.
Oh.
The Catholic Church acknowledges valid baptisms by pretty much anybody.
Because they want as many Catholics as possible.
Yeah. The exceptions, of course, are groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. They don't like those groups performing
They
baptisms
take an
and will not
atheist
recognize
over
them.
a Mormon. I mean, I guess if I have to declare my belief in Christ, then I'm not an atheist anymore.
Right.
on the
But
surface.
if you're a temporary non-denominational Christian,
Oh.
you could definitely perform.
Temporary non-denominational. I love that. In this moment, I believe in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
I mean, it would be weird to have you perform a baptism, but if you felt the need to perform a baptism,
Did you
it would be
know-
accepted.
I can perform a baptism on behalf of the San Lenatus Fellowship.
Yeah, you can. Not that baptism is terribly important to the San Lenatus Fellowship.
Not yet. This was a terrible tangent.
What's interesting is that voodoo is more vulnerable to change than most other religious traditions because there's no single authoritative scripture or unifying leadership. It's just an oral tradition that passes from one generation to the next and is deliberately adaptable to specific needs and situations. I think that's really fascinating. And so you'll see minor changes from one place to the next or one generation to the next. But for the most part, it's still something that you could recognize looking back as being a similar related tradition.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think, just knowing its history rooted in slavery is that's something they would want to keep recognizable, right? As part of their
Exactly.
culture that survived that whole ordeal.
Right. While it was originally syncretized with Catholicism, an awful lot of voodoo practitioners in America have also incorporated elements of Judaism and Hinduism in more recent years.
Interesting.
Right?
Did you find any specific practices that were incorporated?
Not specifically, just other scholars saying this is a thing that I've
okay.
noticed. And it's possible they're just like, this feels kind of flavored like, since I didn't find those specific notes.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm just curious. Are we going to talk a little bit more about Baron Samedi?
Yeah.
All right. It's a very good rum.
I believe you.
Good rum. Great design too.
Yeah.
You can tell it's voodoo inspired rum.
Makes sense with a name like that.
Yep. He's kind of I don't want to say most popular because in the religion, he's probably on par with anyone else, but sort of for outside observers of voodoo, Baron Samedi would probably be the most recognizable spirit. Like we said, he guards the dead.
He takes the good, those who have not displeased him, back to Guinea and allows them to live in the paradise that is there. And if you've done something to offend Baron Samedi, then you would be left here to kind of suffer and potentially even end up as a zombie, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, which is, again, where the voodoo gets this like weird rap. But yeah, they absolutely believe in zombies, but not like the Walking Dead zombies.
Yeah, no, it's kind of weird. And everything that we see in Baron Samedi, there are some that will attribute all of that to Papa Legba. So things differ from one place to another. Not really that big of a deal.
Yeah. All right. So if you were practicing your voodoo beliefs, what the heck do those look like?
Oh.
Is it ritual sacrifices? Kidding, it's not.
I mean,
there's rituals.
there are rituals. There are ritual sacrifices, and they're important, but they're not like the be-all and end-all defining feature of the religion. I think one of the most visible things that you can see in voodoo is the use of veve, which are sometimes kind of abstract, sometimes more obvious. They're drawings, line drawings that are used as beacons during rituals that represent specific loa, and they can look really cool.
So the loa will possess these things as the presence in the ritual, is the belief.
Until they move from that to a person,
Right.
which is a thing that happens.
That is a thing that happens. And these are drawn on the ground with usually some sort of white powder, most commonly ash and cornmeal, but it would depend on what you have on hand and where you are in the world. And
Yeah, we got variety there for sure.
yeah.
So animal sacrifices are used to give energy to the loa. They take the life energy from the sacrificed animal, and that's used to rejuvenate and re-energize the loa to whom it is offered, which sounds really foreign, but if you get through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that's not wildly different from what we see in the sacrifices offered at the temple.
And it's like a chicken, and then they eat it.
Yeah,
Like-
it's much like we see in the Jewish tradition. It's more of a holy barbecue situation where people share in the meal in most situations.
Yeah, it doesn't go to waste. If you need to wrap your head around and think about praying before you eat dinner,
Right? Not
you're
wildly
just doing
different.
you're just doing a little more prep work.
Yeah. And so I think that's kind of cool. These sacrifices are not used in casting dark spells or anything shady, because that's not what the religion is about.
No, there's really not like Wicca, where they really do believe in spell casting and magic. That's not where, and like you said, that's not actually spooky, but that's where that's not where the ookie spooky and voodoo comes from. It comes from the possessions, the spirit possessions that I probably misunderstood, that are definitely misunderstood.
Definitely.
But it is a very again, I'm an atheist, so it is a very foreign thing for me to, I watch a bunch of YouTube videos on spirit possession and voodoo, but Christians are taken by the Holy Spirit and end up rolling on the ground and speaking in tongues. So,
Right?
So part of me is
It's not
like,
wildly
that's
different.
Yeah, but for me, I'm like, well, yeah, that's hard to wrap my head around. But yeah, depending on your even fairly mainstream Western religious practice, this isn't actually that out there. It's just
Right.
a different spirit.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's the same spirit and we just haven't all figured it out yet.
Right? So the whole deal with possessions in the voodoo tradition is actually really interesting to me. And the terminology is kind of interesting too. A person who is being possessed is referred to as the horse. And the incident of possession is called mounting the horse. Kind of an interesting turn of phrase. I don't think this is universal among all voodoo, but definitely seen in Creole voodoo.
Well, and it's an interesting just imagery to kind of put it into context. And like I said, I watch a whole bunch of YouTube videos on voodoo spirit possession, and these people don't remember what's happened to them. So I kind of, even if it's not universal, I like that imagery of you are the vessel.
Yeah. You're not the active participant.
No.
It's kind of interesting. And so Loa are specifically called to possess a person, to bring a message or accomplish a task, sometimes performing business transactions, which seems a little bit weird, but isn't actually crazy because the God of Abraham is a covenant-making God. So having somebody show up making business transactions, still not that foreign. Or sometimes they'll simply show up to receive worship, which is not too crazy. Sometimes, however, things get a little bit more complicated. A possessed person could receive an unexpected loa, or even a sequence of several loa, which makes for an interesting day or week.
Several days.
Yeah, there's no set time on how long these possessions can last. And this seems like it could be a problem when, say, the possessed person has social duties to perform.
Yes. That being said, I guess it depends on where you are in the world. Maybe if you're in Louisiana, it's a little different. But when in a place like Haiti, where especially in the rural communities where voodoo is a way of life, people would be like, oh, yeah, he's possessed by a loa. And they either like wait it out or get a priestess to intervene or to figure out what the spirit wants. But, I think, if this was your everyday life. And again, I watched a lot of YouTube videos. Yeah, there was one where some guy's son was possessed and he was just like wandering around the town. And they were like, well, better get the priest involved now because it's been a minute. But
yeah, there are ways to artificially end a possession, to say, hey, it's time for you to go back home, Loa. There's also ways that people will act to prevent possessions that aren't wanted. Usually it means putting something in your hair or your headdress or your hat or whatever. Wax is used actually pretty often in this way.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was kind of nifty. That
I also saw sort of the opposite to that, where people the spirit has a preferred color,
Mhm.
and they would know that. So these whole like houses and villages are painted a certain color to encourage a specific Loa to come. So I
Mhm.
saw trees painted blue and houses painted blue, and so that whatever spirit they want to come to visit is more likely to come visit, and she knows that's her place. She's welcome there. It was a
Right.
female spirit in this case, but
A lot of work goes into this.
yeah, I mean, a lot of work goes into a lot of religions.
Right. Like Wicca, as we talked about, where people are really not too keen on dividing good magic and bad magic, or black magic from white magic. It's just magic is the thing. It's the tool, not, it doesn't have a will of its own or a moral value. In the voodoo tradition, they feel the same way. They don't like distinctions between good and bad magic, but there is a thing that's called red magic, which is named because of the color of the eyes when a person is possessed by a malicious spirit. I thought that was kind of nifty.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So it's not like any moral quality thrown on the color red, apart from the malicious spirit happens to cause this thing in a human's eyes, which there's a lot of things that can turn eyes red. So there's no real moral value put on that red color either,
Yeah.
apart from the fact that it's a warning of a malicious spirit.
Yeah, and I was thinking while you were talking that, you know, this good versus bad or white versus black magic, like in you know, Western Abrahamic religion, God's will is God's will, whether you agree with it or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I disagree with some of this, but you know, someone gets cancer and they say, well, that's God's will. That person saying that doesn't go, cancer's bad. They're just saying that's God's decision. Right. Or they're not saying God is bad. Excuse me. That's just God's decision. That's his bigger plan for you. So same thing if you're kind of going, where does this fit? Or how do I make sense of, but this feels bad or wrong. That's a parallel I was thinking about.
Sure. Yeah,
It's a fair parallel.
I think so.
Okay. Just like in Shinto, altars are a big deal. And funnily enough, they always include images of the Catholic saints, even if that's, I mean, I guess it would relate to the spirit that they're trying to invoke, but it's not like they're saying, hey, St. Patrick, come for a visit. They're trying to bring the spirit that was synchronized with St. Patrick, Damballa in this case. But I just think it's funny. You see all these like Catholic prayer candles and statues, and
Right.
that's not really it at all.
It's an interesting combination of faith traditions for sure. In addition to saints and the more common Loa and the Vodun, ancestors are often revered and added to the list of Loa, and are sometimes invoked in various ceremonies as well. Like if your grandma was a great sorceress or priestess, depending on your tradition, you might want to have her come and help you with something specifically.
And this I actually found really interesting because it's so different than North America, is that in Haiti, graveyards are actually family owned, because that's how important a graveyard is in their rituals, whether that is for invoking a family member or accessing Baron Samedi. Graveyards are huge in their rituals, so they're just like privately owned.
I think it's pretty nifty.
I mean, I don't want to own a graveyard.
Yeah, I feel like an awful lot of people think it's weird until you realize how many people, even among Christians and atheists, want to be buried on their own homestead.
I guess so. I just like, and maybe this is partially North American culture and partially the state of the world, but like people move around so much. My grandparents are buried in Saskatchewan, and we're not in Saskatchewan. We're in Alberta. And who knows where I'll end up when I'm at that, you know, last
Right.
half of my life. So to have a privately owned family graveyard is like, it feels like more of an inconvenience. But, North America, far more affluent than Haiti, unfortunately.
Yep.
So we're a lot more mobile and yeah, so I can see why if you're kind of staying where you grew up that it would make sense. But yeah, I'm not shipping bodies to Saskatchewan.
Right.
My notes say this is where voodoo can get kind of spooky. Is that human skulls can be included in some of the altars. And like I said, altars are very common to be found in graveyards since this is where spirits like to hang out. But this is not exclusive. Some people have their own home shrines or there's community shrines or altars as well. So you're not just always going to find people in graveyards in Haiti.
Yeah. So the idea of fetishism is attached here. And I feel like we posted on Instagram and Facebook about what a fetish is. But I'm going to restate it here because I think it's a great point to illustrate that a fetish is not an obsession or a kink. A fetish is an object that brings you power. Within shamanic traditions like voodoo, a fetish is a necessary tool in a charm. Much like in your sex life, where a fetish is what gives you the power associated with arousal, without which you might be impotent.
No.
So a fetish gives one power. So if we get pedantic, having a foot fetish sounds relatively innocent. Owning a foot fetish sounds a bit creepy.
Do you own a foot fetish?
Do I own a foot fetish?
Yeah,
No.
Okay. Do you have a foot fetish?
No.
Okay. I don't know anyone with a foot fetish.
I bet you do. I bet you do know somebody who has a foot fetish. But most people don't talk about their fetishes in polite company.
That's fair.
But I feel like it's a lot more common than most people expect.
So on the topic of foot fetish, like a rabbit's foot is a fetish.
A rabbit's foot is a foot fetish.
That you own. Because it's an object that you've put luck on.
Yeah, if it brings you luck, if it's a talisman or a magical artifact of any kind, that's not a non-fetish. It is a fetish.
And it's a foot, so it's a foot fetish. I just think I'm hilarious right now.
Right?
So bad.
And an awful lot of man-made objects are believed to have supernatural powers in the voodoo tradition.
Yeah, and this is just like in Shinto where a spirit could possess basically anything as well.
Yeah.
During rituals at the altars, offerings of food, like we said, animal sacrifices and drink, which is typically rum. I think that has to do something with the geography, are offered to the spirits.
Absolutely. Pour one out for the departed, pour one out for whoever's collecting.
Yeah. One for me, one for the spirit. One for me, one for the spirit.
Right.
Okay, so what everyone's wanting to hear is about voodoo dolls. And I was so excited to learn about voodoo dolls. And then I was grossly disappointed because they don't exist.
Pretty much, yeah.
Voodoo dolls do not exist. It's like a karate chop. Doesn't exist.
You trying to tell me that there's no such thing as a karate chop?
Oh, wait, no, it's a judo chop that doesn't exist.
Yeah, judo's all throwing, isn't it?
Yeah, and pinning. No, but when I was a kid, my dad used to go, judo chop. My dad used to go, judo chop. And then I learned that judo chops aren't real. And neither are voodoo dolls, and neither is Santa.
Hey, Santa Claus is real. He's just been dead for a long time.
So he doesn't deliver. So, on this horrible tangent, voodoo dolls don't exist. They come from English folklore. I'll flashback to last episode. And they're actually called poppets. Poppets are used exactly how culture has made the voodoo doll to look out, where you represents a human and you cast magic on it. The idea of the voodoo doll is it's anti-Black sentiment. Basically, they're trying to make voodoo look like a scary religion and dehumanize it, but voodoo dolls don't exist at all. Like there's nothing even close that I could be like, oh, it was taken from this. No, only the puppets, which are English folklore, are.
See, I did find some voodoo doll-ish things in the voodoo tradition in my researches, but they were not meant to be used to hurt people.
You do not stick pins in them to give people body aches.
No, that's not it at all. They're pretty much exclusively used to draw positive attentions of the spirits to the intended person. And from my observation, they're not super common, but I've seen some work that says that they are real things.
Oh, interesting. Everything I read said, nope, you've been fooled.
Maybe the dude I was reading up on had been fooled.
Maybe. But there you go. So, like I said, all this making voodoo to look like a scary, devil worshipping, dangerous religion is basically racism.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not basically
How
racism.
can we villainize the black people?
Absolutely, yeah. How do we make them other?
Yeah.
But all that being said, they do believe in zombies.
They do. It's interesting. Most of what we see as the zombies, apart from, of course, the more popular science fiction zombies that we've been seeing in the last couple decades, most of them are kind of tied to the Haitian tradition, but that's not to say that they didn't exist in the West African tradition either. Nzambi is the Congo Bantu word for God, and Nzumbi is a Congo Bantu word for fetish. And so the zombie that we see is in between, but part of both worlds. It's kind of interesting that it's an object with the divine power connected to it. And they are basically slaves to a bokor, or a sorcerer. They have no personality or spirit or will of their own. And they are just mindless, kind of like we saw in Dawn of the Dead, which is nice and simple and slow and dumb.
I mean, I saw the reports that basically it's like being in a coma. You can be that kind of zombie too, where like you appear dead, and they honestly they probably aren't dead.
Sure.
But they believe that there's still like this life force in them, and they have no control. So
Yeah. And sometimes they are walking around, and those freak people out real bad.
I believe that.
But there's also the opposite side, where a second kind of zombie is a disembodied spirit. And both of these are terrible fates that are meant to be avoided by faithful Vodun practitioners. And the threat of being turned into a zombie was used to keep Haitian slaves from killing themselves to escape their terrible slave drivers, who were also usually slaves themselves. So life in Haiti before the revolution really sucked.
Yeah. And was that to just like preserve the population and the culture?
Yeah. It's awful.
Yeah, because I mean, they're discouraging you from killing yourself to be a slave.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's awful. And what I thought was really interesting, I went looking up into some law books. And Article 246 of the Haitian Criminal Code, which was established in 1864, dictates that turning somebody into a zombie counts as attempted murder. I thought that was really interesting, that it is attempted murder rather than outright murder. So I think they get some credit for knowing the difference. Because it's hard to say that a walking body is dead, but you've definitely messed him up.
absolutely.
There's been a fair bit of research looking into how these zombies are actually made. And it's a few chemical compounds that basically make you just mentally malleable, like super easy to control and docile and slow. And some details kind of line up with a stroke. It's pretty messed up.
Yeah.
But there are some elements that they haven't been able to really figure out what's going on with it. And the morality of the issue is actually the problem, because part of one of these compounds is made from the brains of a buried child. we can't go ahead and be testing that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't know this for sure. This is just Katie talking out of her ass. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that is just the faith of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That
It's kind of like frog's eyes.
Yeah, right. That if a placebo, right? If you believe that somebody's tried to turn you into a zombie, and then there's chemicals already that are interfering with your brain chemicals, and you have this belief for your entire life in voodoo and in zombies and in spirits. Impressionable is not the word I want to use because I think that's unfair, but it's the best word I have for what I'm trying to describe.
Yeah, there's a lot of social reinforcement behind the existence of these zombies. If you are told and are in a state where you're going to believe that you are dead and a zombie, you're going to behave that way.
Yeah. And
people who see you and know that this has happened to you are going to treat you this way. There's no discouraging it. It's hugely problematic. Not that it's a common everyday practice. The people who make zombies are generally hated by their communities at large because it's not...
Yes, this is not a smiled upon practice.
No, zombies is bad.
Yeah, no matter what tradition you're in, zombies are bad.
But it's fascinating that it's such a visible part of Haitian folklore and also visible in other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely.
On a lighter note, I think it's interesting to note that today most voodoo practitioners in the Americas, at least, and the Caribbean, have been baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. In 1993, Pope John Paul II actually spoke favorably about the magical tradition that has become so tightly bound to the church, which of course was spoken out against by an awful lot of people who don't like the Pope and Catholicism. Some of the more American traditions of Christianity were like, it's proof that the Pope is terrible and the Pope is a Satanist in disguise, which is nonsense.
Again, when you don't believe in Satan... I mean, I guess the Pope would believe in Satan.
He does. But the people that he's offering favor to don't.
Yes.
He visited the Vodun practitioners in Benin in West Africa and praised their faith and told them that being Catholic does not require them to betray or abandon their Vodun traditions.
How henotheistic of him.
Right? Except he is definitely speaking from a point of, hey, y'all need to become Catholic.
Yeah, no, you can keep that, but you got to become Catholic too.
Right.
Yeah.
Because he is saying this fully aware that syncretism has been a thing in their tradition for so long that it's just like, hey, that God that y'all talk about, worship Jesus now.
I was going to say, his name's JC.
Right. And I think it's kind of interesting. While there are bad actors in voodoo traditions, like the Bokor sorcerers that we mentioned before, voodoo is not about casting spells on people or hurting people. That's not the deal. You're not going to make friends hurting people.
Wouldn't last as long. Yeah.
Right. The voodoo tradition is about healing. I think that's kind of the best takeaway from all of this. On the small scale, it's about healing individuals in times of need, being able to call on Papa Legba or Baron Samedi when somebody is near death and bless them and have them turn out okay. Pretty cool. Pretty positive stuff. On the larger scale, voodoo is about healing a nation and in some respects the whole world. It's born to us in a place of pain, carried over by the slavery and some terrible abuses, but it's all about becoming better and healing.
I like that. That was a really hopeful message, Preston.
Yeah, I can't take credit for it. That's just what I've gleaned from my studies.
All right. I'll take credit for it then.
Sure.
You're not going to do it. I will. All right. Well, I really enjoyed learning about voodoo.
Right?
And if you enjoyed learning about voodoo, you should check out our Discord and hop into the conversation that we're inevitably going to have about voodoo. And you should check out our Patreon so that we can keep producing great content like today's episode. Or if a subscription model is not your thing, you can always check out our Spreadshirt and buy some sweet, sweet holy watermelon merch.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.